Hello and welcome back. I wanted today to talk about the contrast controls. And I'm going to skip over the contrast controls that are part of this HDR, dodge, and color burn dropdown. We'll talk about them in a later video. But I did want to talk about these contrast controls because they're kind of interesting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the black level because we talked about that when we talked about the exposure, the first video in the series. It acts as kind of the opposite of the exposure slider. I'm going to talk about and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about clarity because it kind of actually more ties in with this whole HDR thing, local contrast, and changing how contrast is affected. I'm going to talk instead about the contrast center, and gamma. And so the first thing to do, I think, in talking about these, I'm going to open up the tone curve, which is right here. And this is not going to be a lesson on the tone curve. Gosh, there's probably a million YouTube videos and books on how tone curves work. And I really, if you want to be really good at Silkypix, I suggest learning how to use tone curves because you can do a lot with them. I may go over more stuff on the tone curve maybe in a later video, but what I wanted to show you was that if you check this box here, show tone on the tone curve, every raw converter, whether it's Silkypix or Adobe Camera Raw or DxO or whoever, they all do this. They create a tone curve as part of the presenting you with what your raw file should look like. Because if they didn't, the image would look very flat. In fact, I'll show you what it would look like. If you go up here to average contrast and you choose standard, that sets the contrast to 1, the gamma to 1, the contrast center doesn't matter at that point. And this is what we'd be looking at. And if this is what raw converter companies were showing to their end users, they'd all go, oh wow, that looks terrible, your raw converter must be no good. So they try to put you at a better starting point, which in this case is the average contrast. So this is kind of the starting point, and you can, by clicking this little button, you can actually see, and by hovering over gamma and contrast center, and you can see this curve that's been added. And unfortunately, I can't mouse over that curve because when I do, well, you can sort of see it. It's like this little gray curve here. Now, it's important to know that this is not the same curve that your tone curve affects. You can't directly affect this curve using the tone curve. The tone curve is applied afterwards. So, you can do your normal tone curve thing, maybe brighten up the shade, lower the highlights or whatever. That's different from what these contrast controls are. These contrast controls happen much earlier in the pipeline. The tone curve happens later in the pipeline, which is useful when you're doing black and whites to know that, because then you can use your tone curve to do things like toning and changing, sepia toning and platinum toning and all that other stuff. I'm going to hit initialize all just to reset that. So let's look at what these do. Contrast should be pretty obvious. Here's a contrast curve here. And curves, the steeper the curve, the greater the contrast, and the shallower the curve, the more shallow the contrast. So fairly shallow here, steeper through the midtones, and then kind of shallowing again near the bottom. And increasing in contrast increases that curve, as you can see, and increases the overall contrast. And lowering the contrast does the opposite, reduces the amount of contrast throughout the image. Actually creates kind of an inverted curve where it's flat in the middle and steeper in the highlights and shadows. One thing to remember, and I mentioned this in one of my quick tips, is all of these can be made higher or lower. You can go much lower than what the slider lets you think. You can actually go make a contrast of 0, which is basically a flat line across the histogram. You can see it right there. There is almost no contrast at all. This is almost like looking at the color channel. On the other side, you can take your contrast up to, I don't remember the biggest number, greater than 6, 9, in which case your contrast curve is almost vertical. This huge contrast change right there. So kind of getting back here, contrast center really just says where is the steepest part of this contrast curve going to be. And by default, it's a little to the left, a little in the mid-tones, but kind of on the edging towards the shadow areas over here. And again, you can move that. As you move it, it changes where the steepness of the curve changes. So here it's steeper down here. It also has the effect in this case, because there's a gamma applied and contrast applied, of kind of raising up these parts of the shadow so the image appears a little bit brighter. That can be useful. If we move the contrast center not all the way over, because it can be moved further over, you can see it has the effect of moving the contrast. Here you can actually, if you go up in here into the histogram, this white dot, white arrow, whatever you want to call it, actually shows you where the center of the contrast is, where the contrast is the steepest. And this is one of those other things you can just keep making higher and higher. I think you can, with the 0.9, at which point your contrast curve is up here. You can see this is where your steepest part of your curve is, and then the center of the curve, and then everything down here. It does tend to make the image look a little bit darker, but if you need to add some contrast into the highlight areas, this would be one way to do that. I'll click on here, I'll bring that back. Gamma is interesting. Kind of want to think of gamma almost like a brightness control. And the easiest thing to do, again, to kind of see what it does, is move it back and forth. So all the way at, and it can go even lower than this, but pushing it all the way to the left in the sliders, you can see that the gamma has kind of compressed all those shadows. It's made everything darker. And moving it all the way to the right, you can see it's changed that curve, so now that it is really brighter throughout the image. This is almost as if you'd taken the tone control and just yanked it up a little bit. The tone curve, I mean. So you can kind of think of this gamma as a brightness control, similar to the old brightness slider that used to exist, not entirely the same, but similar to the old brightness slider that used to exist in early versions of Adobe Camera Raw. And so if you do just need to make an image a little bit brighter, rather than moving up here in HDR and dodge and tone, the gamma is a pretty nice way to do that. In this image, maybe something like that would be good. If I were going to do a full edit of this image, I would probably raise the exposure. I would probably bring up the black point. That just naturally, in addition to just setting black and white points, which lets you stretch out and add more contrast throughout the histogram, it just gives it a lot more, I think, depth, especially the black point. And then, keeping this gamma up keeps the image. If I put the gamma back where it started, it feels a little bit dark to me. Some people may like this look. I want to just open it up again I thought that looked pretty nice. I love these colors. Spring has finally sprung around here. As I took this morning on a walk around the neighborhood, I had to actually wait because you can sort of see there's a road back here and there are cars driving by, so I did have to wait a few seconds before I could take this. But I love the colors, just absolutely beautiful. Contrasted nicely with the greens. So there's a basic edit, and that's really how these curves work. And you can always add, in addition to these sliders, always feel free, look at the tone curve, see if there's areas that you might want brighter or darker. I think I'm pretty happy with this, but you can always use a tone curve to do really amazing things. The other thing, just a quick tip, bonus material here. Your tone curve by default is set to manipulate the red, green, and blue channels, basically all those channels at once, moving them up and down. You can also do individual channels, which can be useful for various creative things. This L is fairly new. It came out in either Silkypix 7 or 8, I don't remember which, but it basically gives you just the luminosity value. So it acts kind of like, if you're familiar with LAB space, it acts kind of like the luminosity value of LAB. And the nice thing about doing that is that as you adjust luminosity values, it tends not to affect colors. You don't have to worry about color shifts, which you can sometimes have if you're working in the RGB tone curve. So I'm just going to reset all that. I think I was happy with what I had. Might even blink the black point up a little bit. But that's the contrast tools. You have a lot of control with them, and don't forget to also use them in conjunction with the tone curve. You can, someone actually read something recently, someone said tone curves are dead, and that's to me a shame. I think I understand that, you know, if you have a editing on a phone or a tablet, tone curves can be kind of tricky, but if you learn to use them, and there's a ton of tutorials out there on YouTube and books and whatnot, there's a tremendously powerful ability to manipulate the tones in your image. That's all for now. Thank you for watching. Feel free to hit like. If you have any comments or questions, put those in the YouTube comments or questions, and we'll try to do another one of these in a week or so.